Well, good morning. Welcome to the Morning Report. My name is Willie Lawson. I want to start today with a very simple question, or I think it's simple. It doesn't seem simple, though. Is there a right to immigrate to the United States? Not a moral desire, not a humanitarian appeal, not a personal dream, but a right. Because if you listen to politicians and activists and cable news panels and college professors and more than a few people on social media, you would think the answer is obvious. They speak as if immigrant or as immigration is a human right, as if America owes entry to anyone who wants it, as if borders themselves are morally suspect, as if saying no is some kind of sin. And if you challenge that assumption, if you even question it, like we're doing here today, you're told that you're cruel, racist, fearful, or ignorant. So today, we're going to do something radical, crazy. We're going to slow down. We are going to define terms. We're going to look at the law, the history, the sovereignty, and the reality. We're going to ask a question that desperately needs to be asked. Where did Americans get the idea that people from other countries somehow have a right to come here? But okay, here's a spoiler up front. There is no such right. It's not in American law. It's not in international law. It's not in moral philosophy. And it's not in the real world. And once you understand how this myth was created, you'll never hear the immigration debate the same way again. Okay, let's begin with definitions because the confusion thrives where definitions die. A right is not something you want. A right is not something that would be nice to have. A right is not something you feel strongly about. A right is a claim you can make against others that they are morally or legally obligated to respect. The American political tradition, rights fall into two basic categories: natural rights, things that you possess by virtue of being human, life, liberty, property, free conscience, and civil rights, protections granted within a political community, voting, due process, equal protection under the law. Notice something important here. Rights exist within a political framework. They are inherent to human existence or tied to citizenship in a particular nation. There is no recognized category of rights that says you may compel another country to accept you. That would be absurd. And if it were true, no country on earth would have borders that meant anything. The right to immigrate would mean a right to enter, a right to remain, a right to use public resources, a right to legal protections, a right to political influences over time. And that's not a right. It's membership. And membership, by definition, is selective. Let's bring this down to brass tacks. The United States Constitution does not let me help you. The US Constitution does not, not grant a right to immigrate. In fact, it does just the opposite. Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the explicit power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. What? Crazy that you're not hearing that in the debate over common sense immigration laws, are you? Article 1, Section 8 gives Congress the explicit power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. That means the people of the United States, through their representatives, decide who may enter and under what conditions and how citizenship is granted. And the Supreme Court has affirmed this repeatedly. Or people who can read. The power to admit or exclude foreigners is considered a core attribute of national sovereignty. Not optional, not symbolic, essential. The court has never ruled that a non-citizen has a right to enter the U.S. simply because they want to. Even asylum, which we'll talk about later, is a process, not an entitlement. So when someone says, people have a right to come here, what they're really saying is, I believe the United States should not be allowed to control its own membership. That's not compassion. That's a radical political position. Now let's deal with the favorite fallback argument. And I've heard this as a matter of fact, as I'm doing this, I hear some of you saying this, yelling at your phone. International law says people have a right to migrate. No, it doesn't. International law recognizes a right to leave your country, a right to seek asylum, a right not to be returned to persecution in certain very narrow cases. It does not, let me help you again, it does not, one more time so you can get it in the back. Why don't I tell them this? It does not recognize a right to enter another sovereign nation. It does not. In fact, international law explicitly affirms the right of nations to control their borders. The United States owns documents, the United Nations own documents acknowledge this. Well, finally, of course. There is no treaty that forces the US or any country to accept unlimited immigration. If there were, Japan would not exist as it does, or Hungary wouldn't exist as it does, or Norway. Borders still exist because sovereignty still exists, despite what activists wish were true.
Billy Graham famously said that he believed that the next move of God would be believers making a difference in the marketplace. In fall of 2019, Anton Kresick moved to Washington, D.C. He began his career in the political arena. Two things became very obvious. Godly principles were lacking on both sides of the aisle. Many of the organizations were putting profits before people. 7 Weeks Coffee was started to reverse this trend and live out Graham's calling as believers in the marketplace. As a value-based business, we have a simple and transparent mission. Donate 10% of every sale to pregnancy care centers across the nations. We are committed to earning your trust, not expecting it. How do we do this? Leading with our values, showing the impact, and providing the highest quality product. I am a Christian, I am a conservative, and 7 Weeks Coffee unapologetically supports pregnancy care centers across the nation. Join us by letting your coffee serve a greater purpose.
So, if there's no legal right, no constitutional right, no international right, Why do so many Americans somehow believe there is? And here's where things start to get ouchy, uncomfortable. Humanitarian language has been replacing legal language. So over the past 40 years or so, immigration stopped being discussed as law and started being discussed as emotion. Everybody does it. We use words like dreamers, families, desperation, hope, compassion. These are powerful words, but they are not legal arguments. And this shift happened deliberately. If immigration is framed as a legal process, you can debate it. If it's framed as a moral emergency, dissent becomes cruelty. Number two, activism masquerading as morality. Many Americans were taught, explicitly or implicitly, that borders are artificial. Nations are outdated. Identity is fluid. We see that, don't we? Authority is suspect. So, in that worldview, restricting immigration feels immoral, even tyrannical. But here's the truth they never say out loud: every functioning society restricts membership. Families do, churches do, clubs do, nations do. And if you believe exclusion is always immoral, then you don't believe in communities at all. Number three, guilt politics. It's the one thing that nobody wants to talk about. Many Americans, especially elites, have been trained to see their country as fundamentally illegitimate. Here we go: colonialism, slavery, imperialism. And from that lens, America has no moral authority to say no, because it seems as owning the world, as owing the world some permanent atonement. Immigration becomes reparations by another name. And once you accept that premise, borders themselves feel somehow immoral. All right, let's also clear up one more massive source of confusion. And I told you we talk about this. Asylum is not immigration. I'm going to say it two more times. Asylum is not immigration. One more time. Asylum is not immigration. Asylum is a narrow. Can you see narrow? Legal protection for people facing very specific, individualized persecution based on race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership in a particular social group. It is on a case by case basis. It has to be evidence based and temporary. Temporary. Now, for those of you who, I don't know, like me, went to public school, temporary doesn't mean all the time. That means for a time and then not. Okay. What it isn't is this: it is not economic or migration. It doesn't, I thought it doesn't include, well, your country's economy sucks, so you came here instead for a search for a better life for your family. That's not what asylum is. General hardship, where things just sort of suck where I live. I'm going to come to the US and seek asylum. That's not what it is. Well, them people wilding out down there. Crime is crazy. Yeah, it is because your government sucks. That's not a reason for asylum. Climate concerns. That's so stupid. I don't even know how to make that funny. When asylum is expanded beyond recognition, it stops becoming protection and starts becoming a loophole. And loopholes destroy systems. Some people will say, why do you care? America is big enough. And that question reveals the problem. The nation isn't just land. The nation is law. The nation is culture. The nation is trust. The nation is shared experiences and shared expectations. Mass immigration without consent strains schools, housing, healthcare, wages, social cohesion, and more importantly, it erodes democratic legitimacy. If nations no longer controls who joins the political community, then citizenship itself becomes meaningless. And that's not compassion. That's surrender. Now I want to take this, expand this a little bit at this point. I want to talk about the earliest 20th century mass migration. And that's the one that we always talk about and we hold to our chest so dearly and bring us your poor, bring us your downtrodden and all that stuff, Ellis Island. Uh, for those of you who follow me, you know that I'm about to finish up our final week of ragtime and where I play Booker T. Washington. For the sum of my life, yes. That Booker T. Washington in ragtime. And I'm thinking about this because it's a period piece of that time. That immigration right there was this. Yeah. It caused incredible poverty, not because the immigrants were bad. It was the scale, it was the timing. The sheer volume was enormous and it was sudden. So between 1880 and 1924, the United States absorbed about 23 million immigrants, largely unskilled, largely poor, largely arriving in concentrated urban areas. So this was not some gradual assimilation. This was an industrial era shock loading. Cities like New York and Chicago and Boston and Philadelphia, Cleveland were simply not prepared. They couldn't have been because there was no modern welfare state. There was no federal housing programs, no Medicaid, no Medicare, no food stamp, no public health infrastructure worth the name. And the result, you know, like I said, here's where the romanticized Ellis Island story collapses. Tenement living, entire families living in single rooms, in places where there was no indoor plumbing, shared outhouses, leading to open sewage, which gives you tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid, child labor, kids working in factories, kids working in mines, kids selling newspapers at 2 a.m. And this wasn't some cultural choice, it was an economic necessity. And because of it, wages were crushed. Basic supply and demand economics, massive influx of unskilled labor. Employers had endless replacement workers. So the wages stayed low. Safety stayed minimal. Unions didn't rise despite mass immigration. They rose because workers were desperate. This is where the modern commentators love to ignore. The systems were overwhelmed. They weren't resilient. They were overwhelmed. Public schools, overcrowded classrooms, incredible language barriers. I mean, you had your few English speaking poor kids. You had people from Haiti. You had people from Poland. You had kids from Hungary. You had kids from Germany, Austria. You have kids from all over the planet in the same classroom. Now, there was no Rosetta Stone. There was one teacher. Nobody spoke the same languages. The dropout rate was high because people had to work. It was truly work or starve to death. And if you work, you might have starved to death anyway. Minimal compulsory education enforcement couldn't make them do it. Public health. Cities could not track disease. Quarantine was inconsistent at the very most. The very best, it was inconsistent. Hospitals were charity based and overwhelmed. Housing, no zoning, no building code initially, no. So, which is why some of these tenements were fire traps. Slumlords thrived. It was easy. I've got this building. I'm not going to maintain it. There's a whole bunch of rooms in here, and there are rats, and there are roaches, and there are fire hazards, and if you just pay me, that 5 cents a week, I don't want to hear about it. So fires were common. Okay, so there's no way out of there. There's no fire escape. So fires were common and often deadly. Cities didn't adapt smoothly. They broke. They had to reform later. And poverty wasn't intergenerational. It's not a quick climb. Another myth is that the poor instantly prospered. No. Many immigrant communities remained poor for generations. They lived in ethnic enclaves. And we see that, especially in big cities up north. Well, this is the Polish part of town, and this is the Jewish part of town, and this is the Hungarian part of town, right? The Italian part of town, right? They had limited upward mobility initially. Assimilation, like it does, took time. Assimilation, like it does, took structure. Assimilation took restriction, which leads to a point that nobody, well, except me, wants to say. It's the restriction that helped stabilize the country. In 1924, the Immigration Act didn't come from nowhere. It followed decades of urban poverty, decades of labor unrest, decades that crime spiked in certain areas. Does this sound familiar? Overwhelmed by decades, you follow about overwhelmed local governments, public backlash, and not all of it irrational. Does this sound familiar? Once immigration slowed, guess what happened? Wages started to rise a little, assimilation accelerated, public schools got on their feet a little bit. The New Deal era reforms became administratively possible. You cannot build a safety net while constantly adding more people to catch. And this is not anti-immigrant. This is pro-reality. Here's the key distinction that you will appreciate. Acknowledging strain is not blaming immigrants. It's recognizing limits. The early 20th century lesson is simple. Mass immigration without capacity planning creates poverty. Mass immigration without capacity planning creates poverty. Poverty creates political instability. Instability forces reform or collapse. America chose reform, but it took restriction to get there. Now, why this matters now? The parallels are obvious and uncomfortable. Large numbers, concentrated arrivals, local governments paying the price, elite insisting everything is fine, citizens being told that they're immoral for noticing strain. Does it sound familiar? History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes, and right now is practically singing backup vocals. Okay, yes, the case can be made. It has been made by serious historians and economists that the 20th century mass migration increased urban poverty and it suppressed wages. It overwhelmed local systems. It delayed effective social reform. America eventually absorbed those populations because it slowed the inflow and invested in integration. And that's not cruelty, that's governance. Borders are not immoral. Borders are actually moral. They allow accountability, solidarity, self-government, responsibility. A nation that cannot say no cannot meaningfully say yes. Charity without consent becomes coercion. Generosity without limits becomes chaos. And no society has ever survived on chaos. So let me say it as plainly as I can say it. There is no right to immigrate to the United States. I'll say it one more time. Well, actually, I'm going to say it twice. There's no right to immigrate to the United States. There is absolutely no right to immigrate to the United States. There is a right to apply, a right to due process once here legally, a right to humane treatment, but not a right to enter by force, deception, or emotional blackmail. America is generous. But generosity is a choice, not an obligation. A lot of us could use that lesson right there. That lesson right there will preach in a lot of different areas. If we forget that, we don't become kinder. We become weaker, less honest, and less free. And that is not who we're supposed to be. My name is Willie Lawson. This is the Morning Report. The Morning Report is a production of fightbackmedia.com, 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 and fightbackmediatv.com. Until we see you again, go out there and learn something, love somebody, and for goodness sakes, y'all take care of yourself. We will see you when we see you. Bye-bye now.